The second session will basically deal with mitigating religious extremism, and I guess Prof. Farid especially has given a little bit of introduction to what we are going to discuss about. I think as a preamble to our discussion, I would like to say that all in all, we have to understand that this idea of religious fundamentalism was basically, before it turned out to become a violent extremism, it is embedded in some of the psyche of the Islamists, namely what we call Hizb ut-Tahrir, which has a presence even in this country. And Hizb ut-Tahrir is very strong in the UK and very strong in Australia as well, right? For Hizb ut-Tahrir, for example, they say that democracy is nizamu kufr, a system of blasphemy. Therefore, it is strictly haram for Muslims to adopt it, implement it, or call for it. And that's the basic understanding of Hizb ut-Tahrir. And we see another a jihadi organization called Al-Jama'ah Al-Jihadiyah of Ayman Al-Zawahiri. He said that whereas in democracy the legislator is the people, in Tawheed, God is the legislator. Hence, democracy is shirk. Okay? Thus, participating in democratic process at whatever level is haram, and those who perpetrate it are apostates and infidels. Now we see this even among some of the Muslims in this country who believe that democracy is basically un-Islamic, right? And that's why they're calling for kind of more Islamic polity in terms of approaching to establish an Islamic state. So under a traditional Islamic education paradigm, students study the same text with different teachers and they will get different perspectives. So in this type of Prof, you're written about madrasa, right? And I believe I would like to read that book as well. And a system that does not promote critical thinking, such as these traditional Islamic schools, and our sister brought up this issue just now. Blind imitation or taqlid is very dangerous indeed, right? So you have to basically follow whatever your teachers say or whatever your teachers tell you. And the ability to quote verses from the Quran isolated from the context of passages and without providing the contextual background for which those verses came about, what we mentioned as maqasid, the higher intention of it, was one of the reasons for the perpetuation of radical interpretation of the text. And that's what has been mentioned by both speakers just now about the literal interpretation of text. This is a problem that plagues many modern-day Kharijites or Khawarij, in the form of extremist Muslims, a version of Islam being perverted by the Prophet of Islam, who had directly warned against. What did the Prophet say? They recited the Quran, but it did not pass their throat. That's what he said. So how do we handle these intricate issues in stemming or mitigating religious extremisms? And I think with that, I leave it to the esteemed speakers to put forward the case. Prof?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Dr. Farooq. How much time do you want to do? 20 minutes? Okay. Just keep an eye on the time for me. Thank you. I think one of the ways that I think that we can mitigate some of the issues. Does this mic work?
Yeah.
Maybe I can use that.
Sorry about that.
One of the ways that I think I'm thinking that we can mitigate this question of violence is to make religious literacy in Islam a little bit more complicated and a little bit more dense. I know that's not what many people want to hear. People want to hear a very simple understanding. Islam is simple. You know, Deen is easy. And so people want easy fixes. I'm sorry, I'm bringing very bad news. There are no easy fixes. It's a much more difficult process. I want to basically concentrate on two things. One is, I want to start from a story of Rumi. So I'm not going to quote you verses of the Quran, not yet, maybe later on. But I think one of the things that we need to get used to is to understand narrative. Understand narrative. Why is Rumi so influential? Rumi is influential because Rumi speaks through parable, through metaphor. And people were smart enough to understand what Rumi was saying. Today we have to write commentary after commentary to make people understand what Rumi means by a snake or by emeralds or whenever he uses terminology. That means that we have become illiterate about our own traditions. We don't understand our traditions anymore. A couple of months ago, I was at a very important kind of close working group talking about the future of Islamic reform. And one of the colleagues presented a paper using an idea of Rumi to begin to think about how Rumi thinks about self and other. You know, all morning we've been talking about the other, you know, Christians, Hindus, Buddhas, how do we relate to that? And how Rumi struggles between self and other. And the immediate response from a couple of professors around that was, how can you quote Rumi? Rumi's a poet. Poets are always doing extreme and ecstatic things. This is not really thought. And with a very quick way, they could dismiss the contribution of Rumi. Okay? Because people have been trained to think that only using Quranic verses and hadith can give you authoritative speech. They don't understand that Rumi captured the imagination of vast amounts of Muslim Orthodox scholars who understood Persian. And he captured the imagination because Rumi translated the meanings and messages of the Quran and the prophetic tradition into his poetry. Therefore, the Mathnawi is called the Quran in Persian, because the messages of the Quran is there. Now, most people today will say, oh my God, how can you even say the Quran in Persian? The Quran is only in the Arabic. But this is how Muslims thought before. And so if you are surprised, it's because you're surprised at your own ignorance. We are surprised at our own ignorance, therefore these things come to us as strange and foreign. And therefore there's a very interesting report of the Prophet that he said, "Bada al-Islamu ghariba wa sayaudu ghariba, fatuba lil ghuraba." That Islam came as a stranger, a voice in the wilderness. It came with a new proclamation where everybody were ignorant about these proclamations. And it will become again estranged to the world. But good news to the strangers. So in every era of crisis, at every moment in crisis, you're going to find people that are going to come with unpopular messages and correctives. And those are the strangers that you must give hospitality to. And you need to listen to what they are saying. And they're going to speak sense. And so, when you read someone like Al-Mawardi wrote on Islamic law, but he's also well known for writing about political thought. But Mawardi has a very interesting book called Adabud Dunya wa Deen, on the etiquette of how to live in the world and how to deal with questions of deen, that is, the etiquette of deen. The same thing that Ghazali later on talked about, the adab in Ihya Ulumuddin was all about the adab of that and the adab of that, of this. So Ghazali elucidated on the etiquette and the ethics of all the practices. But before Ghazali, there was Mawardi in the 11th century. And Mawardi writes in his Adabud Dunya wa Deen, and this is what he says. In this book, he says, أجمع فيه بين تحقيق الفقهاء وترقيق الأدباء والبلغاء. That I will combine in this book the verities of the jurists, but also the subtleties of the shu'ara, the poets, and the rhetoricians. If only I remembered this line of Mawardi, I could have shut up that professor at that conference who said, how can you quote Rumi? I should have told him, that you should have learned that you didn't do your homework properly. You did not remember what Mawardi says. Mawardi says, when he writes about adab, he takes seriously not only the fuqaha, the jurists, but also the insights of the rhetoricians and the poets. Because poets also have access to the truth. They tell us the truth in different ways. And so what it is that we need to make sure that the Islamic literacy is a broad gauge literacy. So what I'm calling for, the antidote, the immunization process that we are talking about is not a quick fix. It means that you may have to make investments now that you will see the harvest in 100 years' time. You need to make investments now in the learning circles that Prof. Alatas talked about, study circles that you need to create, and learning groups, and you have to have public fora like these where people are educated and learning the skills. Oftentimes, people want to go and learn Quranic verses and hadith. I'm not saying that is bad, but you need to understand that that Quranic verse has a huge archive of learning that you need to understand how that verse was understood over time. And that you also have the right to understand materials today in the same way that people in the past had the right to understand. Part of the problem on the crisis of the modern Muslim is that the modern Muslim thinks that authenticity only belongs to the past. Only when you have yellow pages is that authenticity, that is the old books. And only if you can quote an Arabic sounding authority like Mawardi or Ghazali is that authenticity. Unfortunately, I'm playing the same game by quoting to Al-Mawardi and also, but how can you teach an old dog new tricks? I half repented. But I'm talking about the intellectual project, and obviously Muslims like to see continuity. So I'm consistent with continuity of the tradition, and that we learn from the past, but the past is not authoritarian. The past is instructive. And what we need to do is to understand the intelligibility of the past. And some parts of the past will become unintelligible. There are lots of things about the past that is unintelligible, and we don't have to worry about that. But we also want to have that part of the past that is intelligible. So this is the thing that many of us have not learnt yet, that while the Prophet said, خَيْرُ الْقُرُونِ قَرْنِي ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ, that the best of communities is my community, and then the next generation and next generation in terms of the virtues, and that they were part of the prophetic light and the prophetic community, that the Prophet did hail the earliest community as the important one. But people forget. And I know over lunch, Professor Duderija and Professor Alatas had the whole thing about conversation about the companions and the status of the companions, and that some schools of thought believe that the companions are complete paragons, that you cannot engage in any kind of critique of the companions. That's where the Sunni Shia tradition have slightly different position. That for in the Shia tradition, some companions are more virtuous than others, and so on. But anyway, what most of us forget is the Prophet also said the following. Once he was sitting with the companions and he said, I wish I could be وَدَدْتُ أَنْ أَكُونَ مَعِي إِخْوَانِي. I wish I could be with my brothers. And the companion said, are we not your brothers? He said, no. La antum ashabi. You are my companions. My brothers are those who will follow me without seeing me. الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِي وَلَمْ يَرَوْنِي. Those who will believe in me and follow me without seeing me. So the Prophet then had a wish that he will be with the future generations. And he called them his fellow brethren. And I guess if the Prophet was today, he would have included the sisters with his brothers and sisters. So we can do the kind of adaptation that the Prophet would have included, because the Quran did talk about mu'minun and mu'minat, believing men and believing women. So we can make this. But the dominant ethos in that time was to, when they used ikhwani, they mean men and women. Of course. And so people don't understand that the Prophet put a trust in the future generation. So it's not that all the authenticity lies with the past, but a lot of optimism and hope is put on the future. Another thing that the Prophet said, he said that مثل أمتي كالمطر لا يدرى خيرها أولها خير أم آخره. That the parable of my community, my ummah, there's going to be a conference on the ummah by Nottingham University. If I was there, I would have started off with this, that my community, my ummah, is like the parable of rain, a rain shower. You don't know whether the best part of the rain shower is in the beginning or at the end. You don't know whether the best part of the rain shower is when it begins or when it ends. Because if it doesn't end, you're going to have a flood. If it doesn't happen, you're going to have drought. Right? So the Prophet is saying that the ummah is not only the good guys at the beginning, but also the great people that come later on. So Muslims must start believing in themselves. You must have trust in yourself that you can be as authentic and as part of the ummah as the people in the beginning were. Because if the people in the beginning are going to do all the work, then you are going to be on holiday. And it doesn't mean that you have to be on holiday, or it means that you are going to make no contribution. So it means that you have to take your responsibility seriously, and that's the point I want to come to, the question of responsibility. The way to combat extremism is to domesticate the ethics of responsibility. And the ethic of responsibility is absolutely crucial. I said I was going to start with the parable of Rumi. So Rumi says, when he uses parables, the parables are always multivalent. They have many, many meanings. And Rumi says that what happens is that, he says that it is said that when a snake does not see a human being for 40 years, it turns into a dragon. You mentioned dragons earlier, so I thought I will try and help you out here. That when a snake does not see a human for 40 years, it turns into a dragon. That is, it sees no one who would cause its evil and vileness to melt. They're still quoting Rumi. A big lock indicates that there is something valuable and costly inside. The greater the obfuscation, the better the essence, like a serpent guarding a treasure trove. Don't look at the ugliness of the serpent, of the snake. Look at the value of the treasure. So some clarification here. Rumi always talks about a house in ruins, a building in ruins, and in that ruins there's always a snake, a serpent hiding. And the serpent is the metonymy or the figure of speech for the lower self, the nafs, the bad self. Okay? And so, if that lower self is not addressed, is not treated, if no one looks at it for 40 years, this lower self turns into it metastasizes into a huge dragon. So instead of when you could have, if it remained a snake, all you need to be is a good snake charmer and you can get the snake out. But now that that snake metastasizes into a dragon, you need a dragon slayer. You need a lot more things. What Rumi is saying is that the self must be addressed all the time, because the self can quickly run away and become prevalent and become biased and become predisposed to evil. So the vileness of the snake can be melted if a human being is there. And the human being in Islam, the idea of a human being in Islam is that the human being distinguishes him or herself from all other creation because human beings took up responsibility. إِنَّا أَرَدْنَا الْأَمَانَاتِ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ وَالسَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْجِبَالِ فَأَبَيْنَ أَن يَحْمِلْنَا وَأَشْفَقْنَ مِنْهَا فَحَمَلَ الْإِنسَانِ. That we presented, God says, we presented responsibility, stewardship of the world, we presented it to the earth, to the heavens, to the mountains. All of them declined and receded, but human beings accepted it. Then the Quran ironically jokes it makes an ironic statement. إِنَّهُ كَانَ ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. The human beings was oppressing and ignorant. It is an ironic statement. As much as the Quran boasts that human beings take it, it also knows that sometimes we will falter. We will be ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. There will be moments that we will become stupid and ignorant and self-oppressive. But it still boasts that we are responsible. So human beings are the responsible people. That is what the Quran talks about. The human beings are responsible. Therefore, we are Khalifatullah. We are the stewards of Allah on earth because of the question of responsibility. And so the parable of Rumi is basically this, that this treasure that this serpent is guarding, this treasure, the emeralds behind it, is the treasure of responsibility. And what it is that we have become now so ignorant that now we require a dragon slayer to free the treasure from this vileness there, so that we can now re-embrace and become familiar with responsibility again. So storytelling is an amazing aspect. That's exactly what the Brethren of Purity also did. They had a more philosophical stories. Hayy ibn Yaqzan. So what I'm urging us is that we need to read both the classical texts of the tradition of literature, but also modern texts. Part of the problem is that we are so obsessed that we need to read Quran and Sunnah that we don't read anything else. We need to read modern novels. We need to read modern poetry. It's only then that you understand the conditions of human. You need to read Hannah Arendt. You need to read the contemporary thinkers of the world so we can understand what the human condition is. If we are not going to become a reading community, we will not even understand how to spell responsibility, leave alone act out on responsibility. And so understanding and implementing responsibility today means that we have to be familiar with the knowledge of today. And the big crisis about the Ummah is, and about young Muslims are, that they think that the only knowledge that is relevant is the knowledge of yesterday and knowledge that has an Islam sign on it, that has a halal sign on it. And that is not true. Knowledge, all knowledge is your treasure. Al-hikmatu dallatul mu'min fa'inama wajaduha fa ahaqqu biha. That knowledge is a lost treasure of the believer. Wherever he or she finds it, they are the most entitled to it. And this is precisely. And for Rumi, the question of responsibility is the question of love. Responsibility brings love. That is the core of the Islamic message. Surprise, surprise. The core of the Islamic message is love. لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. You do not really totally believe, you haven't totally attained faith if you do not love for your fellow believer what you love for yourself. Loving each other, caring for each other. That's the core of human existence, love. Ghazali writes in Ihya Ulumuddin, in the book on the Kitab al-Ishq wal-Mahabba, Kitab al-Mahabba wal-Ishq, on the book of love and passion, he says that self-love is at the core, that we love ourselves. The human ego is based on our love for the self. He said, if it wasn't for the fact, this is not the bad love for the self, this is the more philosophical understanding. If it wasn't for old age and sickness, all of us would love to live eternally. But old age and sickness makes us debilitated, and then we wish, our bodies cannot hold it, and we wish to be relieved of the burden of living. But it's because we love ourselves that becomes the engine that we can also love others. So it's kind of, it's the egotism, not in the bad sense, in the good sense, that it's only because we know who we are and we love us. Because this is the most concrete thing I know. My memory, which is my beginnings, that is the only thing I know. It's through that self-knowledge that I can know the other. And for Ghazali, the driving engine in that self-knowledge is self-love. The love for yourself. And through that self-love, you can love others. That becomes the cement. that how you can build that. So it is a core of that is love. So the antidote to all this thing that people coming with vile understandings of Islam, the test would be how much love is in there, how much care is in there, how much compassion is in there. If it doesn't have those, if it cannot check the checkbox of love, of compassion and care, it doesn't mean anything. Then it is some kind of distortion. But it must have those as core components. You must have love, you must have care, you must have compassion. So all the kinds of thinking that people might have doesn't really work. So no matter what kind of authenticity that people come with and show you all the authenticity of the past, and no matter how long their beards are and how many turbans they wear, or how many books they check and authority, if it does not deliver on love and on care, on compassion, there's something flawed in it. So this kind of utopian Salafism or utopian anything that we have within Islam, sometimes you have utopian, you have some kinds of Sufism that's also violent in outcome. You have some kind of different thing. We need to understand you must have a checklist and you need to take responsibility. It is the antidote is now, because I talked earlier that we now have cellular globalization. Information reaches you through cells, your cell phone, your iPad, it reaches you, no longer mediated. There's no, so you need to be inoculated, like viruses, like flu. Each one of us must take the flu shot. You need to take some kind of immunization. Each one of us must have sufficient amount of knowledge to be able to distinguish the good from the bad, the genuine from the false. And you need to have resources within yourself. Remember the very famous hadith, istafti qalbak, walau aftaka al-muftun. Okay? That you need to ask your heart. You need to ask a fatwa from your heart. Even if the muftis have given you the answer. Even if the jurisconsults have given you the answer, you must ask yourself, is this right? And I just identified to you that the checklist must be love, compassion, and care for others. Don't let anybody tell you, but you have to kill people in order to get the Islamic authority established. That doesn't have to be the answer. You have to do X and Y and destroy in order to rebuild. Those people don't know what they're talking about. You look at the history of India. 800 years Muslims were ruling in there. 400 years they were ruling in Spain. When you look at the history, why those empires declined, one of the first things you see is that self-destruction. Aurangzeb, that everybody thinks is a great emperor, and he was a great emperor, but he made some catastrophic mistakes. The catastrophic mistake was that he kept on fighting and fighting and fighting for almost 30 to 40 years and bankrupted the treasury. The Yusuf bin Tashfin, the North African leader, who the Muslims of Spain invited to come and help them fight off the Christians. Soon he saw the great bounties of Muslim Spain. He went back again and he decimated and killed all the Muslim princes that invited him first time. And slowly and gradually destruction happened. So destruction always happens at Muslims at their own hands, and then they want to know what happened. Self-destruction, and they want to know what happened. So they want to blame somebody. You blame the Christians, they blame global conspiracies, never blame themselves. Okay? So these things have cumulative effects. They don't happen overnight. These things are cumulative. If you're not going to stop the gap with putting your finger in the hole, if you're going to say keep it open, it's going to soon be a gushing hole. So the key questions here is that we need to begin having a serious understanding of thought. Ghazali gave us an interesting interpretive framework of how do we struggle with tradition, and I hope I can convey this to you in a very simple but hopefully in a complex way. And I've already translated this text and soon it will become available. In the text called Qanun al-Ta'wil, on the kind of the rule of interpretation, Ghazali goes through a lot of statements and texts that does not have to be read literally. So for instance, there are hadith that says that on the day of judgment, a ram will be slaughtered, and then the day of judgment will come to an end. Or the Quran talks about your book of deeds, and it will be weighed. And Ghazali says, how are deeds weighed? Deeds are not weighed. So basically, he goes through a whole lot of material in this book. And basically, the outcome is that he tells us that you need to keep these statements that you're getting when you're reading Islamic thought, you need to keep it into tension, a triangular tension. The first point he makes is that do not refute reason. You cannot refute reason. If you ignore, he says, because in order to understand your responsibility, you need reason. So you cannot refute reason. So that's the first point. The second point, he says, don't ever claim that you know it all. You cannot know everything. You only know a finite amount of things at every particular time. So the finitude of what you can know. So humility, intellectual humility. So don't refute reason. Put that into tension with that we cannot know everything, the finitude of what we can know, what is accessible. It's very interesting, he says, he doesn't say the shortage or the deficit of reason. He puts it at the deficit of information that you can have at a particular time. How much knowledge you can have. Because knowledge keeps on growing and you can only have a finite amount of things in your apparatus. And the third thing he says, that when if there are multiple interpretations, then don't only get stuck on one. Don't get stuck on one to the exclusion of all the others. If you hold on to one, you must be recognized that there are multiple other interpretations and they are equally strong in their persuasion. So you must keep that into tension. So when you are going to read the tradition, keep in mind the following. Don't refute reason, that there's a finitude to what you can know at a particular time, and therefore intellectual humility. And thirdly, when there's multiplicity, celebrate the multiplicity. Celebrate the intellectual pluralism. And I'm going to end with a dog story. Okay, because most of you are falling asleep, so I want to see, because, the makan is kicking in, and the blood pressure is going down, but all of you are smiling, and so I have you on my side. You're going to work with me now. So, and that is the dog story. I don't know, Malaysia does funny things to me. I myself personally, I'm not a dog person, but I love the dog story. So Ghazali, for instance, was accused. There's a hadith that says, angels do not enter a house in which there is a dog. So Ghazali then says, well, actually what this means is that if there is carnality in the heart, angels don't enter a heart in which there's carnal sentiments. Because a dog stands for carnality. Canine is a canine. And so the canine kind of features don't have. So people all attacked Ghazali. They told him, but how can you move away from the literal meaning to the figurative? So he said, I don't deny that it also means that. I don't deny it also means, but can also mean that. You see? So you need to be shrewd and smart as Ghazali, okay, to understand that there's multiplicity of meanings. And so Ghazali says, I'm not denying that, but can also mean this. And therefore, this is precisely why Ghazali has such credibility in Islamic tradition, because he deals with complexity. There's no simple ways of. So he's also a man of philosophy, but also a man of theology. He's also a man of jurisprudence, but also a man of spirituality. And so you have to keep all those tensions together. So if you go for the simplex and the simplex version of Islam, you're going to end up into huge destruction that we see that is happening in various communities because of self-destruction. But if you learn what Ghazali teaches us, is that we need to be heirs to the knowledge of the time. And I really want to make the point, and the professor from the Islamic University, we were talking over lunch, is precisely reminded me again that many of the people who are in the kind of forefront of contemporary Islamic thinking in the kind of very dangerous way are people that come from the natural sciences. And they want to implement Islam in the kind of engineering way. You know, so Islam is like engineering. You build, put this, put that, and you... It's not like that. Islam is about humanities. It's about complex thought, humanistic thinking, which is much more broader and much more sophisticated. But that also is also because many of those folks who come with that kind of training themselves are not into the philosophy of sciences. They are end users. They are end users. They are consumers of them. They don't understand the philosophy. So if you read someone like Ludwig Fleck, who was a ceratologist, a Polish ceratologist who died, sorry, didn't die, but survived the camps of Auschwitz, Fleck begins to tell us and educate us that concept, the concept you use determines the object that you study, and the object that you're looking at determines the concept. There's a dialectical relation between concept and object, the conceptualization. So it's a constructivist approach, and that meaning and thought and ideas are also embodied. It's much more dynamic. It's not out there, but it is in here. Because we embody thoughts and ideas and knowledge and reason. Reason is embodied. That idea that people had before, that reason is out there, some kind of ideal, Platonic or Aristotelian ideals, those might have worked at a particular time, but our scientific knowledge tells us something else. And when you begin to, that's how Thomas Kuhn and other people derived from Fleck and others some of the insights that they had. And what I'm saying here is that we need to begin to think in much more complex ways how tradition works. That tradition is just not a box of goodies that you buy and you can open up and check and so on. It requires engagement, it requires the intelligibility, it requires intellectual resources. And I'm not saying all of us have to become intellectuals, but all of us must become thinking beings. And we need to educate ourselves in order to get somewhere. And part of the problem of some of the negative sides of Islamization of knowledge and that kind of rhetoric is that it puts blinkers on that Muslims don't read outside anything that is not Islamic. So we don't know what's going on in the world. And we make colossal and catastrophic mistakes over and over again. Not only once. We do it repeatedly. And every generation reinvents the wheel. So there's no continuity. I mean, some of us are still where Muhammad Abdu and Afghani was 100 years ago. We've moved on. We need to begin looking at what they did, take the positive, but also engage in a critique and move on. As the next generation will critique us, aspects of our work, and build on that and take it forward. There's always critique and continuity. And that's not a bad thing. Critique is good. And so we need to be able to do much more complex work. I cannot tell you what to think, but I can tell you where to begin looking for. And don't be like the Hoja. You know Mullah Nasruddin, the Hoja? One day, the Hoja was sitting on the street and looking on the ground. And he's searching. So a number of passers-by came by. I said, Hoja, what's going on? I said, I lost a very valuable thing. So the other person started looking around with the Hoja for another 2-3 hours passed. They said, we can't find it. So I tell him, Hoja, where did you lose this thing? He said, well, I lost it over there. He said, but why are you looking for it here? He said, well, because the street lamp is here. Okay? Sometimes you have to put the light right on where you lost it. You need to shine the torch at the place where you lost it. And a part of it, we lost it in this world we are living. We're not looking outside the boundaries we have created because we are scared that knowledge of the West is dangerous, it's going to destroy us. So I've just finished a book on the madrasas, and you'll read it by April next year, where you see how religious scholars are saying Muslims should not, even Muslim religious scholars who are studying Islam, should not be looking at, they should not be studying modern science and sociology and anthropology and those kind of things. These are dangerous knowledges. Only some people must study it first and make it kosher and then hand it over. Those people don't even know how knowledge works. Even in Islamic thought, even in the Greek knowledge and Islamic tradition, knowledge is much more complex. So what they think of knowledge is some kind of laundromat. that you can take, you can take it to the washing, you can wash out knowledge and give you clean. It doesn't work like that. Knowledge is not a laundromat. Knowledge is knowledge. You get the good with the bad, and you need to have the resources to sift it. But you see, one of the first things that people come, and I'm surprised no one has asked us yet, okay, but what is the limits of thinking? What is the boundaries of thinking? Most people would say, oh, you're talking so much. Where's the limits of thinking? Your limits is your own conditions under which you live. But theoretically, there are no limits. But you know what you can do. I don't want you to become an intellectual suicide bomber in Malaysia, that you're going to say things that Jakim or other people are going to throw you in jail. So be smart. So your conditions are going to impose limitations, but you need to be challenged in a non-violent way. Within the legal framework, you challenge the boundaries, as the Prof pointed out. What you said to it? Legal civil disobedience. It's his idea, not mine. So let them come to him. And for a clarification, I'm out of here on Wednesday. So the thing is that. But as he pointed out, that your circumstances are going to determine the boundaries, and the amount of knowledge that you're going to inject into your society is going to expand the boundaries. So if you treasure knowledge, your society itself is going to treasure more. So you're going to open up the envelope yourself and expanding the envelope. But if you're going to be scared, if you're going to be a scared person yourself, oh, be careful, don't ask that question, you're already losing the game. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Alaysa shifa'ul ayyi fi su'al," that isn't the remedy to all things in asking a question. It had to do with a companion who had a massive, head injury, and the head injury was very severe. Then he needed a bath. He needed the ghusl. And people said that he had to take a cold water bath in the battlefield. He took the cold water bath, whatever it took, and that just aggravated it, and he died. And then they reported this to the Prophet. The Prophet said, who told him to take a bath? But if you guys didn't know, they said, well, we didn't know. If you get into a battlefield and you need a ghusl, you have to take a bath. But what about tayammum? You can just do the symbolic wiping, because this person had a good reason why he could not wet the wound, and then he died as a result of the aggravated circumstances of the wound. And the Prophet said that isn't the remedy for a complex issue by asking a question? Shifa'ul ayyi as-su'al, that you have to ask the question. So the tradition gives us opportunities, but it's we who have to put together the tradition. And we need to go to those parts of the tradition that are today estranged. We need to espouse those parts of the tradition that we are estrangers from. That even we get a bit scared. We say, oh, did the Prophet really say that? Okay? And I know there are people going to tell you, but that's hadith mawdu. That's hadith that has been fabricated. Or that hadith is not relevant. Don't worry about that. Look at the wisdom behind it. If the wisdom makes sense, you go with it. So let me leave you there with a few thoughts of how you combat and how you innovate, inoculate yourself and immunize yourself as a way to find remedies and mitigation as you go forward. Thank you very much for your patience.